A hot summer day in Melbourne, and commuters on the Westgate Bridge are left stunned by a senseless act of violence.
It was just too shocking, so the first instinct was not to believe it.
At the centre of this appalling crime was one man, a father, and shockingly, the victim was his own daughter.
When he asked Freeman what he'd done, he didn't answer, just got back into his car and drove off.
You just don't know how anyone can murder anyone, but to do it to your own flesh and blood, it just begs belief.
Paramedics worked for an hour at the scene, trying to revive 4-year-old Darcy Freeman.
That her father was involved, it automatically appalls you, and it's just beyond belief, really.
I've been a policeman for 34 years, and that's as upset as I've been in terms of investigations that I've overseen.
Faced with silence from the father, questions needed to be asked. Just how could somebody commit such an atrocity?
They'd gone to 5 different psychologists to find out why this man had acted this way. You know, was he mad or bad?
The chilling story of the tragic death of Darcy Freeman was a crime that shook Australia. On a hot January morning in 2009, a man drove his car to Melbourne's Commonwealth Law Courts. He carefully reverse parked, fed the meter, and then led his 2 young sons inside.
He arrives at court, picks up his son and says, "Take my child." And they have no idea what's going on.
Almost catatonic was the way that I would describe him. He wasn't at all responsive, clearly upset.
And he's standing, looking out, and his boys are at his feet, and he's shaking, and he looks like he's sobbing, but you can't see his face. And all his staff are milling around him. And I cannot get that image out of my head.
The man's name is Arthur Freeman, a 37-year-old tech worker from Melbourne. Hours before the confusing scenes at the law courts, Arthur was preparing to drive his sons to school on their first day back from the summer holidays. Also in the car, excited about her very first day at school, was his 4-year-old daughter, Darcy.
It was Darcy's first day at school.
That excitement, especially in the middle of summer, a hot morning, and they were coming from a family holiday, so Darcy's dad was to drop her off for school that day, so there would have been that air of excitement.
Darcy Freeman was 4 years old, described by family members as a determined and strong-willed young girl. She was especially close to her 2 brothers. In 2009, Darcy's family was in a state of turmoil, with her parents Arthur and Peter divorced and locked in a bitter custody battle.
The day before, Freeman had his access to his children reduced by a court.
It appears that Darcy's father was quite angry about that outcome in terms of his access to his children and in terms of financial settlement.
So he'd left the house and his dad had been, "You're really emotional, I'll drive with you." And he'd said no. He now has to live with not getting in that car for the rest of his life.
With his 3 children in the back of the car, Arthur Freeman made the 130-kilometre journey from his parents' holiday home in Aireys Inlet to Melbourne. The plan was to meet his ex-wife, Darcy's mum, at the school gates, so she could hand over a school uniform ready for her first day.
He'd driven from his parents' place down near Geelong. He'd stopped the car at the top of the Westgate Bridge.
A main commuter link from the southwest of Melbourne, the Westgate Bridge is an iconic sight across the city.
It's got a real history, the Westgate Bridge. It collapsed back when it was being constructed. It's certainly an icon in Melbourne and takes a whole lot of traffic out to the west and from the west into the city every morning. So really high volume. And In the peak hour in the morning, most of that volume is coming from the west and travelling towards the city.
Well, any approach into Melbourne on an aeroplane, you can see the Westgate Bridge. It always seems to stand out. It covers the, sort of comes across the river where the river meets the bay, so it's a very long area, and it's, you know, it's visible from just about everywhere in Melbourne.
I don't like driving on that bridge. I've never really liked it. It's, you know, it's not a pleasant place to be. It's, you know, it's high up and it's windy, and you only go over that bridge when you have to.
Just after 9 a.m. on the 29th of January 2009, as his children played games in the back of the car, Arthur Freeman had made a series of frantic phone calls on the 90-minute journey to Melbourne. As the temperature increased outside, so too did Arthur's stress levels. At the midpoint of the bridge, he made a decision that would have a devastating impact on the lives of so many people.
He'd asked Darcy to climb into the front seat. He then carried her to the rail and threw her over the bridge.
The height of the bridge is 58 metres. This inexplicable act, carried out just after 9 a.m. during the morning rush hour, was done in full view of commuters.
So the witnesses were saying, I thought it was a doll, or I don't know what I've just seen. I can't imagine how affected you would be.
Hello, I've just witnessed a man throw a child over the Westgate Bridge.
Thrown a child, did you say?
Yes.
Blonde hair and a ponytail.
Some of them said that they couldn't believe what they were seeing, that they thought it must have been a teddy bear. They just couldn't reconcile it.
The idea that you can get up and go through the motions, eat your breakfast, get in your car and drive to work, and as you're driving to work in, you know, peak hour traffic, you watch someone pull over, put their hazard lights on and throw their daughter over a bridge.
You can't get much more public than driving across Westgate Bridge in peak hour traffic on a weekday in Melbourne. That's about as public as it gets, and to stop your car in full view of other drivers and do what he did. I guess just, you know, the normality of it, just driving along and to see someone stop on the bridge would have, you know, you can only imagine what they would have sort of, you know, witnessed.
Moments before Arthur threw Darcy from the bridge, a truck had passed with a dash-mounted camera.
There was a four-wheel drive, or a truck that drove over the bridge with a video camera that ran on a continuous loop. And we've got his car with its hazard lights on the side of the bridge pulled over, so immediately before throwing Darcy off the bridge. And I remember being really glad that he didn't actually capture that moment, because it's not something that I really wanted my investigators to have to watch.
As the commuters were left stunned by the events unfolding before them, Arthur Freeman quietly headed back to his car.
Freeman threw Darcy off the bridge and then calmly got back in the car.
He drove down and stopped at the bottom of the bridge. Her brother kept saying, "You've got to go back, you've got to go back, Darcy can't swim." Not knowing that she'd fallen nearly 60 metres over the side of the bridge.
Darcy can't swim, Dad. From the eyes of an innocent child, he wouldn't have understood how devastating that fall was going to be. And in his head, he knew there was water there, so yeah, Darcy can't swim.
With the police alerted and the country not yet aware of the tragedy, Arthur Freeman continued to drive his two sons away from the scene, unaware his daughter Darcy, having survived the fall, fought for her life below. When police, ambulance and the media first received calls to respond, they all thought there must have been a mistake. A man had thrown his young daughter from Melbourne's Westgate Bridge, 58 metres into the water below.
I I think the general reaction in the newsroom was disbelief. It was a case of going, what? That doesn't sound right. And the police were saying, look, we don't know, we can't confirm it, but that's what we're hearing.
I remember getting the call that someone had been thrown from the Westgate Bridge. And I remember thinking there must be a mistake, this just can't be right.
We thought it was going to be wrong. We thought that within half an hour it would clarify itself. Maybe it was a doll, maybe it was something else.
And I thought that all the way, even driving to there, I thought there's got to be a better explanation for this, but unfortunately there wasn't. That's exactly what had happened. As distressing as they are, the facts are fairly straightforward, that he's got out of the car, taken this young girl and dropped her over the side of the bridge.
I think people do react differently when it comes to children because of the helplessness of the children, the dependency that the children have on adults. And to have that violated is horrific.
When police and ambulance crews arrived at the scene, the tragedy was confirmed and everybody worked tirelessly to save the little girl, who had been in the water for 15 minutes and incredibly was still alive.
Darcy had been recovered from the water. I think it was the water police had a boat and fished her out of the water. So by then I knew what had happened. It was fairly chaotic. There was a lot of police there, both uniform and detectives, and a whole lot of media there, everyone trying to work out and make some sense as to what had occurred.
Everybody was affected by it because it was so public. He'd also involved everybody else in it. He'd involved those people driving to work. He'd involved the paramedics that had to resuscitate her at the bottom.
The emergency service workers and who did everything, and the doctors who did everything they could to try to save her. Yeah, it's remarkable. That really struck me.
That was a really tough job for the police and the ambulance that had got there immediately. But at the time you're so busy that's not the critical time. I think people cope better when they've got tasks to do. And there was a whole lot to do in terms of Darcy and her care.
As rescue crews frantically tried to keep young Darcy alive, Arthur Freeman drove to the Commonwealth Law Courts, handed over his two sons, and waited for the world to grasp the enormity of his actions.
When he drove off, he drove then through busy peak hour traffic to reverse parked, and put money in the meter at a parking bay. He then walked into the federal court with his two sons and says, "Take my child."
Police arrived at the Commonwealth Law Courts at 10:30 a.m, 90 minutes after Arthur Freeman threw his daughter Darcy from the Westgate Bridge.
And his boys are at his feet, and he's shaking, and he looks like he's sobbing, but you can't see his face.
Unable to comprehend the enormity of the situation, Arthur's eldest son told the court guards his parents' names. When police arrived, the two young boys were cared for by court counsellors.
Arthur was conveyed back to the homicide squad office. A tape was turned on. He almost catatonic was the way that I would describe him. He wasn't at all responsive, clearly upset. So we had to get a forensic medical officer in to examine him, a doctor who made a determination that he was unfit for interview.
In a strange way, it kind of came to a conclusion very quickly.
It wasn't long after that Freeman was arrested. And I do remember the Premier did a press conference that day, I guess just in a bid to in an attempt to put some words to what had happened, to try to capture some of the grief and shock that people were feeling.
You know, I just shuddered when I heard about it. I think every Victorian, you just shudder. You just think, how can that happen?
I don't think Melbourne or even Australia had seen or heard about something like this on this scale.
With Arthur Freeman now in custody, ambulance crews had worked on Darcy for over an hour before her tiny body was transported to hospital for intensive care.
She had some brain injuries, some severe internal injuries and some bruising. The police that attended commenced CPR, as did the ambulance when they arrived, and that continued until she got to hospital.
As news spread of the shocking event, police had the daunting task of informing Darcy's mother, who had been waiting outside the school.
There were two members of the homicide squad that went out to pick up Darcy's mum and take her to the hospital. Darcy had been taken to hospital, so we had some homicide squad members with her and some uniformed members with her, and that's just a really tough day at work.
Darcy Freeman was flown directly to the Royal Children's Hospital, where emergency staff continued their efforts to keep the little girl alive. When Peter Barnes arrived to see her daughter, sadly, she was forced to make a heartbreaking decision.
She'd had to stand there in the hospital and tell the staff to turn off her daughter's life support, and that she did cradle her daughter as she died.
Despite the efforts of ambulance and hospital staff, at 1:35 p.m, nearly 4.5 hours after being thrown from the Westgate Bridge by her father, 4-year-old Darcy Iris Freeman died.
Darcy Freeman was 4. She hadn't lived at all.
It's really, any time there's young children involved, it's really difficult. And young Darcy, she was a young 4-year-old girl, really attractive. We've all got a maternal and paternal instinct, and she's died in a terrible way in tragic circumstances through no fault of her own. So in some ways you shouldn't say that some murders or deaths are worse than others, but clearly these circumstances, they're really difficult to get your head around. And I've been a policeman for 34 years, and that's as upset as I've been in terms of investigations that I've overseen.
The repercussions of Arthur Freeman's actions were felt across the entire city of Melbourne. People were in shock, trying to understand how someone could deliberately harm a child in such a shocking and public way.
How can a man throw his daughter 58 metres to her death? What's the explanation there? And a lot of people were saying, well, he's got to be crazy, hasn't he?
As Arthur Freeman sat behind bars, legal teams and health professionals endeavoured to build a case to comprehend his actions. It was 2 years after the tragic death of Darcy Freeman that her father, Arthur, stood trial. He had entered a plea of not guilty. Legal teams took time to consider Arthur's psychological health, personal history, the family law court decision, family and witness statements, and every mitigating detail related to the case.
The general reaction to covering that trial was people would say, so what are you covering? And you tell them, and they'd say, oh, I can't listen to that, I turn that off. It was people, especially people with young children, were saying, I turn that off when it comes on telly, I turn it off when you're on the radio, I don't listen to that. It's too upsetting.
Darcy's name comes up and you can see the shake of their head. People don't want to talk about it.
There was just something special about poor little Darcy, you know, and what happened to her and the way it was done. It's just it shocked everyone.
As the media converged on the first day of the court case, everyone was keen to see Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes.
We'd never seen Peter Barnes, we'd never seen Darcy's mum, and she lived in WA, so she'd travelled over to do this case. We were aware that that was going to be extremely confronting and that this woman was going through a lot at the time.
There was a respect in the way the media reported the case, and it's a really difficult situation that they find themselves in because there's a need for the news to get out. It's got a whole lot of public interest, not despite the fact that it's so tragic. So they've got a responsibility to report on what had occurred, but they've obviously got kids and they obviously can't be unaffected by what happened. They handled themselves really well.
It was organised with a detective to ask the family if they would consider essentially reenacting a walk for us. So we agreed with Darcy's mum, Peter Barnes, that if we filmed her once, that was the shot we were going to use for the whole trial. It's extremely unheard of. But we decided that she should be given space.
As the trial began, all eyes were on the man who had callously thrown his daughter from the bridge.
Arthur Freeman arrived at court looking like this dishevelled, crazy guy. He had crazy hair. He was later described as a Rasputin-like mad monk kind of image that he portrayed. He was dishevelled and he just sat. I remember he sat in the dock, just staring gormlessly.
I don't know what explanation Mr. Freeman could provide that would make any sense to me or to anybody else.
A lot of people were saying, well, he's got to be crazy, hasn't he? Because in a lot of people's minds, that was the only explanation you could have. That man's mad.
It's very difficult, I think, very difficult for me and very difficult for a lot of people to understand why the offender would overcome all his own values and kill a child.
So on the very first day it was set out, the arguments, the prosecution stood up and spoke to the jury and said, this man wasn't mad. This man killed his own daughter as an ultimate act of revenge against his ex-wife because they were going through a bitter custody battle. And so from then on, that was the argument. Was he bad or mad?
Arthur Freeman's ex-wife Peter Barnes sat in court throughout the entire proceedings, supported by her family.
I don't know how a mother can sit through that and listen to what occurred.
We were very conscious that not only was Darcy's mum there and her family. You go into court as a court reporter and you brace yourself, going, okay, you have to steel yourself against this. But that wasn't the case with Peter Barnes. She took to the stand and she was stoic, she was polite, calm, firm. If he had done this to get back at her, to hurt her, which obviously he had to an extreme extent, she was not going to let him see that.
She had got to that stage where she wasn't going to let him hurt her, and she was quite dignified as the way she delivered her evidence and did a terrific job in giving her evidence under the circumstances.
As the trial continued, the defence put forward their case regarding Arthur Freeman's actions that day.
The argument put forward by the defence was that he was disassociating, they called it, acting like an automaton, like a robot, like acting without conscious thought behind it. And that he did that in that split second when he threw her over the bridge.
I'm not convinced that people offending in that manner are unaware of the wrongness of the behaviour.
Well, the prosecution made a point of telling the jury that they'd gone to 5 different psychologists to find out why this man had acted this way. And all of them had agreed that he knew what he was doing and that he knew right from wrong when he was doing it, and that his act would cause real and significant harm to his child, if not kill her.
During the trial, the jury heard details about the phone calls Arthur Freeman made in the lead-up to Darcy's death. Arthur had spoken with his sister, making no reference to any pending tragedy, instead worrying about his children's school lunches and being late for Darcy's first day. Another call to a close friend in the UK relayed his fears about losing his kids, feeling helpless and being surrounded by angry women in the courts who were not supportive of fathers. He spoke to her of pursuing greater custody through the courts and offered no warning of the horror ahead. The call ended when her phone battery went dead. At 8:54 a.m, Arthur received a phone call from his ex-wife, Peter Barnes. She was concerned Arthur was running late to drop Darcy off.
That's been the catalyst, and for some reason that catalyst has been more powerful than their own awareness of the life of their kid. And that's very difficult to understand.
As Arthur Freeman approached the Westgate Bridge, the terrifying words he uttered over the phone to his ex-wife were a forewarning of his appalling actions.
The words he said to his ex-wife over the phone moments before, "Say goodbye to your children," that are just chilling. And they probably illustrate his intentions at the time, and probably his motives in terms of spousal revenge.
I kill the wife, it's not going to make much difference. I kill the child, my own child, it's going to affect the mother for the rest of her life. You know, something she's never going to get over and never will in any way, shape or form.
When the defence's psychologist was saying, well, no, he was disassociating, the question put to him was, well, why did he do all those other rational things? He acted certainly like anybody else would act when they were driving in peak hour traffic. He's on a bridge in peak hour traffic, but he remembers to put his hazard lights on when he pulls to the side. If somebody is disassociating and not acting consciously, why would they do that? That's a very rational thing to do.
As witnesses testified and evidence was put forward, Arthur Freeman sat silently in the dock, showing very little emotion.
The pathologist came and detailed in very specific detail about the injuries that Darcy Freeman had sustained in that fall. And that was the only time that Arthur Freeman in the dock showed any emotion whatsoever. And he started to wipe tears away from his eyes.
A lot of people actually do feel remorse once they're locked up. So we go see them in these cells after they've been charged or during the trial. And some are actually remorseful. Few, not everyone, but some are actually remorseful and contrite. And if they are, it makes the job easier to be able to tell the judge something about them. If they're not and they come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful issues of mitigation, then I hope we lose them.
I think most of us went to court wanting to understand how a man could throw his 4-year-old child 58 metres to her death. And most people that you spoke to would say, well, he's mad, isn't he? He has to be mad. That was the explanation everybody had for it, because that's the only explanation, plausible explanation people had. You couldn't do that unless you had lost your mind.
It's not normal behaviour, it is abnormal behaviour. It's not right, and it doesn't fit logically that in response to little Blue you had with the mother of the children, you go and kill the children. That's illogical and irrational.
After 19 days, the trial drew to a close, and jurors retired to deliberate on the case against Arthur Freeman.
The jury was deliberating for days and days and days, and we're all waiting, and it had been about 5 days, and they kept coming back and asking questions of the judge, and it was very clear they were very confused about what they had to decide. So after about 19 days of evidence, the jury was asked to go and deliberate and decide whether Arthur Freeman deliberately killed his child or was mad. The thing that was confusing them was that they didn't seem to get, if he's not mad, then he did murder his child. They thought there was other things in between.
Despite denying any memory of what he had done, Arthur Freeman accepted that he had caused Darcy's death. The jury had to decide if Arthur's actions were those of fluctuating madness or filicide.
They were to decide whether this man was mentally impaired or whether he committed murder. But it seemed that they thought they were two separate things. So if he wasn't mentally impaired, then they had to look at whether he'd committed murder. But it was actually very black and white. So they kept coming in and asking the judge, and the judge kept repeating it in a lot of legalese, which is their job, that's how they do it. And then they came in and told the courtroom that they were deadlocked and they couldn't make a decision. And there was women in that jury that were beside themselves. They were crying and looked very frustrated. And there was a lot of tension in that jury. You could see it. Because some people got it, others didn't, and it just wasn't working. And I just kept thinking to myself, what if they come back and find him not guilty?
Arthur Freeman never apologised for his actions or never explained why he did what he did. Often reluctant to appear in court, his trial was an examination of humanity. The jury had spent 5 days trying to understand why Darcy had died and was still no closer to a verdict. In 2011, Arthur Freeman stood in court charged with the murder of his 4-year-old daughter, Darcy. Over 19 days, the court heard evidence relating to Freeman's psychological state, and the jury was deadlocked in their decision of whether Freeman was mad or bad.
It's like a sense of dread, because you honestly don't know what's going to happen next.
He was just a mongrel and a scumbag, and that's why he was there, and there's no other reason.
The 37-year-old's barrister has argued that he was mentally impaired at the time.
It was about 7 o'clock, and usually jurors go home at 4:30. And the judge had said to them, no, I think you can reach this decision. I would like you to stay back. And he said it out very clearly. And in a way dropped the legal jargon and just went, if not this, then this. And they went back, and 40 minutes later they came back with a verdict.
After 19 days of challenging evidence and 5 days of tense and emotional deliberations, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty. Arthur Freeman was responsible for the murder of his daughter, Darcy.
I got in a cab and I burst into tears. Just a sense of relief. It was answered. The family had got their answer now. He was going to be punished for what he'd done. And I just cried. Just couldn't stop crying.
As the family welcomed the verdict, Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes, read her victim impact statement in court and spoke of the heartbreak of losing her daughter.
I think she only started to show how upset she was when she read her victim impact statement, but that was after he was found guilty.
Where to start is a challenge, as this statement brings to the surface all of the raw emotions I live with daily. The saying, time heals all wounds, is not true for myself, and I don't ever expect it to be. Not a day goes by where I do not constantly think of Darcy, where I don't miss her and wish with all my heart that she was with me.
You're never going to get over it, but if you don't do something about it and move on, and that's why these things are expressing yourself in the victim impact statements are all good therapy, and it's good therapy for the people to get it off their chest.
No one can erase the thoughts and associated feelings I have of sitting in the hospital and having to tell the hospital staff that they were allowed to turn the life support machine off, of holding Darcy in my arms as she passed away and knowing that this decision would take her from me again, and knowing that there was no other option available to me.
The sentence was aired live on radio so the community could share in the moment.
The 2 local radio stations here decided to stream the audio of the sentence live. So people were driving around Melbourne listening to the sentence of Arthur Freeman. And I think the decision by the radio stations to do that was to give closure. And I think that was the right thing to do because people needed closure.
The jury rejected your defence of mental impairment, and once that defence was rejected, it was inevitable that you be convicted of murder. This was the killing of an innocent child. The circumstances of the killing were horrible. The throwing of your 4-year-old daughter from a bridge more than 80 metres above the ground could not be more horrible. It follows that you brought the broader community into this case in a way that's rarely, if ever, been seen before. It offends our collective conscience.
The big question in this case was, should he get a parole period? Which would mean that you get a life sentence, but then you would get the opportunity to apply to be released from prison after a certain period of time. It was given that he was going to get a life sentence for the murder of his daughter.
You'll be sentenced to be in prison for life. I fix a period of 32 years before you will be eligible for parole. It means that the earliest date you will qualify to be released will be the 29th of January 2041, when you will be 67 years of age.
That's a big whack of a sentence. We have double murderers in prison with lesser sentences than that.
Well, that particular judge was very good at the sentencing, and so it obviously affected them as well as everyone else in the community, and I believe that what he said was great that he said it, and I just wish more judges would sort of do what that particular judge did.
He pointedly said a lot of people blame themselves, and then he very pointedly said, but you did this, you have to take responsibility for this. Because I can imagine all those people driving across the bridge that saw it. You know, do they replay it in their head? If I'd have rushed him, if I'd have got out sooner, if there would have been people that have passed that didn't stop at all.
Just goes to show how many victims there are in this case. Her death would have affected so many people, from her mother, her brothers, to Freeman's family, to Peter Barnes's extended family, to the people who witnessed what they did, to the emergency services people.
I'm told that some of those guys are still struggling today, because what I think you do is you try to make sense of something that just doesn't make any sense, and it's really hard to reconcile those two things.
With criminal proceedings completed, Arthur Freeman sought leave to appeal his sentence, a request that was unsuccessful. Questions raised in the court case by Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes, with regards to her doctors, were then addressed in a coronial inquest to explore if any lessons could be learned that might prevent similar deaths in the future.
Criminal proceedings were wound up in 2011, and it wasn't until all these years later that the Victorian State Coroner, decided to hold an inquest into her death to examine the roles of health professionals in the lead-up. The focus was on Peter Barnes's meetings with her GPs in 2007 and 2008, and the concerns that she allayed to those doctors, whether those doctors acted responsibly in not reporting her concerns to authorities.
The inquest heard details that police had attended a domestic dispute between Arthur Freeman and Peter Barnes in 2007. After 7 years of marriage, Peter had expressed concerns for her children's welfare to her doctor at the time, after the police intervention.
She had reported, I think, an incident where Freeman came over to her house one day and there was a wrangle over trying to get Darcy's younger brother. So police were certainly aware that, of instances of concern, and that was actually one of the reasons why the doctors didn't report or didn't disclose that information they were presented with to authorities, because they knew that the incidents had already been reported to the police. So they were comfortable, according to their statements, they were comfortable with not reporting it to authorities.
Satisfied that police had dealt with the details of the 2007 domestic dispute, doctors stated there were no emotional or physical indicators evident to them that Arthur Freeman was a threat to his children at the time.
One doctor said in a statement that even in hindsight, he just had no idea that Freeman would snap the way he did.
If they indicate to me, yeah, I had woke up this morning and decided this is what I'm going to do, and some do, it is a different issue, psychologically, I think. And it, in my opinion, intensifies the disturbance of the perpetrator if there is premeditation.
Those doctors never alerted authorities. The reason they didn't was because no one was able to really read Freeman's mood at the time. The Arthur Freeman they saw was always a man of a calm exterior. He was polite.
Family violence is a significant issue, and this is the really extreme end of it. So we'd love to be able to stop it, but it's one of those things that you can look back in hindsight and perhaps point to indicators. He was clearly upset, but the family law court stuff had been going on for some time. There was nothing to indicate that he was going to do what he's going to do.
In 2012, Peter Barnes took legal action against Vic Roads after they repeatedly ignored advice to install safety barriers prior to Darcy's death, a case that was settled out of court. The coronial inquest into Darcy's death recognised the installation of barriers on the Westgate Bridge 2 months after Darcy's death had a significant effect on the prevention of jumping suicides from the bridge.
There had been some other instances of people committing suicide on the Westgate Bridge. Since that time, there have been some barriers that have been erected, so people can no longer climb over or be thrown over the bridge.
The inquest findings place responsibility for Darcy's death solely with Arthur Freeman. His actions and Darcy's death were unable to have been predicted with any great certainty, and recommendations for the introduction of compulsory family violence training for doctors were made.
There's a new push now for doctors to have increased training and to have mandatory reporting. Probably safe to say there's been a renewed focus on family violence issues in Australia in recent years. The inquest into Darcy's death came amid this renewed focus.
Darcy Freeman's name has become synonymous with shock and sadness, a case now etched into the psyche of Melbourne, a timely reminder of the fragility of life, a tiny face of innocence that continues to evoke difficult memories for all involved.
Certainly a terrible tragedy. I'd certainly go so far as to say it's something that I'll never forget, nor will any of the people that attended there on the day, and it will never ever make any sense to me.
People still talk about the Arthur Freeman case. People still talk about Darcy being thrown from the bridge. You hear people in Melbourne talk about how they drive across the Westgate, and even though we have massive security guards there now, which came about after this crime, people still picture it in their heads.
It's one of those cases that still strikes a chord with people. You like to think your neighbours are people you can trust, and that your kids are safe at school, and that the driver in front of you won't pull over on a bridge and do something like that.
He's incarcerated for over 30 years. There are obviously some demons there, but he's got a lot of time to reflect and think about what he did.
The 27th of March 1986 was just a regular day in the heart of Melbourne. But just after 1 p.m, that normality was shattered when a car bomb exploded outside the city's police headquarters. It was an attack that changed a city.
There was just an absolute feeling of total disbelief that this could happen in Melbourne.
There was even a feeling amongst the criminal fraternity that it was a step too far.
A car bomb that struck at the very heart of Victoria.
This was more like a scene from Beirut than lunchtime Melbourne.
I thought the roof was going to come in, so I bailed it out.
It would take diligent detective work and forensic science to bring the bombers to justice.
We were able to piece together, bit by bit, what was in the vehicle at the time it was detonated outside Russell Street.
The Russell Street bombing was a crime that shook Australia. It was approaching lunchtime on the 27th of March 1986. Office workers, court officials and police were going about their business, sitting at their desks, attending meetings or planning what they would have for their lunch. But in one instant, hundreds of lives were changed forever.
At the third stroke, it will be 12, 59 and 50 seconds.
VK City, Russell Street 150, you receive that?
Yes, Russell 150, there's no further personnel required. I will, for the time being, leave a static presence here until we see what develops. Over.
Roger that. And VK City, Russell Street 130, negative, no further police required at the scene. The 150 will leave some members static in St Kilda Road. Received?
30, copied.
That particular day I didn't have a busy morning, so I actually went up to the Australian Taxation Office to pick up some forms as it was tax time for all of the staff in my office. And on returning, I had an appointment at 1 o'clock with a client, and I was aware that I was right on that time.
It was very busy police-wise, very busy court-wise, just a normal day.
I was allocated to the civil court that day. A former colleague of mine was to pick me up approximately at 1 o'clock, so I was on the western side of Russell Street, on the court side, with the police headquarters directly in front of me.
I turned left into Russell Street from Latrobe Street, looked for a parking spot and saw one right at the front of Russell Street and did notice a brown Commodore sedan parked there.
Also on Russell Street that lunchtime was a young police officer serving at the City Watch House, opposite the Russell Street headquarters. Her name was Angela Taylor, and she had just volunteered to collect lunch.
I watched Angela Taylor leave the building. She left from the main entrance on the Russell Street side of the Magistrates Court, came down the steps, started to cross the road.
As I got around the corner, I became aware that it was actually very quiet, and I was just about to run across the road so I could make my 1 o'clock appointment when I noticed a car coming from my right through the intersection of Latrobe Street. And I thought, no, I'll let this car go. And as he got adjacent to me, I looked back at the Commodore and up it went.
Russell Street 750. POC Russell Street 750.
Russell 750.
750, I presume you heard that loud explosion right next to you?
Russell 750, it totally shattered our windows. Roger that, Russell Street 306. All units approach with caution just in case there's a second.
There is 2 on 4 on St Kilda Road just approaching the city. What's going on? We're having loud explosions. We've had a car bomb in Russell Street outside the police station.
Unbeknownst to the witnesses that day, the Holden Commodore parked outside the Russell Street Police headquarters contained almost 60 sticks of explosive, packed into the boot, centre console and glove box of the car.
It blew me about 6 or 7 or 8 metres back into the bluestone wall of the Magistrates Court. The car completely disintegrated and there was metal flying everywhere.
All of a sudden then I was aware that my left thigh had been struck by something. My second thought was that this is a bomb.
Yeah, that car's still on fire. Can we have the fire brigade here, please? Roger, stand by.
I looked behind and saw this big black plume of smoke, saw that it was in the vicinity of Russell Street. People are coming out and walking towards to see where that explosion is coming from.
Right back.
A sea of confusion, and as you may see in some footages, the people are coming out, the minor explosions now occur.
There's been a second explosion. Units, stay away from the area.
What were I believe to be petrol tanks and the likes. But even as a trained investigator, I didn't turn my mind to a terrorist act.
I'm sure there was a shock component that kicked in because although I had a clearly a serious injury to my leg. I wasn't even aware of the pain.
There was a great deal of panic. I remember some of the one particular policeman who appeared to have just lost control. He was screaming at people and, quite frankly, he wasn't doing any good. The police decided that we were in an unsafe situation because there were still some explosions going on. So I was told, take your ambulance and the people you've got on board and move further back.
The communications section was on the first floor, which is only just slightly above the level of the street. And fortunately, that particular building, that particular office had very heavy curtains on it, and a lot of the shrapnel and the glass, of course, the blew inwards when the car bomb detonated. It was caught by the heavy curtains in the communication centre. Otherwise, of course, there could have been people in that part of the building that could have suffered very serious facial injuries, of course, from flying debris and glass.
Across Russell Street, the magistrate's court had also been damaged by the explosion. Lawyer Bernie Barmer was in his office when the bomb detonated, and in the chaos, he realised he needed to get out.
I thought the roof was going to come in, so I belted out and straight down the steps into Russell Street, where I ran into poor old Angela. And what drew me to her attention is that, like, her bootlaces were on fire. Her clothing had been predominantly blown off.
Angela Taylor had been caught by the full force of the blast and had suffered horrific injuries.
She was the bravest girl of all get out, and she was uttering things like the bastards and shit like that. She must have been in huge pain.
Southern 507, we have people with injuries. We require an ambulance, please.
I was working retail and it was just a small toy shop, and I had the radio on and they said there's been a bombing and there's been a woman that's hurt. And my first instinct and thought was, it's not my Angie, they're talking about a woman and I've got a little girl.
Angela and the other wounded, including fellow officer Constable Carl Donadio and Ian West, were rushed to hospital. The two men were suffering from severe leg injuries after being hit by shrapnel. Back at the scene, there was a dawning realisation that the very fabric of Melbourne had changed forever.
It just, all of a sudden, everything changed. From a bustling city that Melbourne was in that time, it went quiet. It was an unusual quietness all through Melbourne that I'd never really seen before. There were people on the streets, but a lot of people just standing around, couldn't understand what was happening.
We couldn't even let people in to put the fire out at that stage because we didn't know what else was there, and ended up having a man suited up with the appropriate clothing protection to go in there and put the fire out.
As soon as the fire was under control, police moved in to lock down the scene and ensure there were no further explosive devices. The fact that Australia was at that time unfamiliar with the threat of terrorist bombs made their task all the more challenging.
Immediately after the bombing, and even the first responders, there was just an absolute feeling of total disbelief that this could happen in Melbourne. Before this incident, we'd had minor incidents that might get you a bit concerned, but this was an absolute attack on police and society in Melbourne.
The Victoria Police response was to form a dedicated task force of detectives. Their purpose? To bring those responsible for one of the most heinous acts of terrorism Australia had witnessed to justice.
Job one was the crime scene. We virtually closed off a city block, and we started on the outside and worked our way in. because, of course, we needed to reopen the streets. So a search was done on the buildings surrounding Russell Street, and everything that was found within that precinct was labelled, photographed in situ, and it was a very steady, systematic processing of the scene.
As detectives began to piece together the vast quantities of forensic evidence at the scene, tragic news reached the task force. Their friend and colleague, Angela Taylor, had lost her fight for life 24 days after the explosion. She was the first female police officer in Australia to be killed in the line of duty.
She was compassionate, and if she had a skill that she could help someone with, she would want to use it.
Yeah, that's pretty well why she wanted to join the police force. Yeah, she wanted to
make a difference.
She wanted to put something back into the community. She was that way inclined.
It was a comfort to know that the people that she worked with wanted to do what they could. I remember there was a young woman that was in her squad that wanted to be outside her room, and she volunteered to do that. And that must have been very hard, because the whole squad, I'm pretty sure, was close to Angela.
I think it's fair to say investigating the murder of a colleague has a lot of responsibility. You have to maintain a very strict discipline around this is another investigation. But behind it, of course, there is a fact, and an indisputable fact, that this was an attack on us.
In March 1986, the city of Melbourne was reeling from a terrorist attack that targeted police officers. The car bomb that exploded outside police headquarters tragically claimed the life of a female police officer who succumbed to her wounds 24 days later. As the people slowly came to terms with what had happened, police focused their efforts on finding those responsible.
As a result of the bombing, just about every criminal haunt in Victoria, if not Australia, was raided. Turned up guns and drugs and whatever, and I think even the part of the criminal element thought that this was a no-no.
There was even a feeling amongst the criminal fraternity that it was, that this was a step too far, and of course, the byproduct of that was it brought a lot of attention to the criminal fraternity, and there was probably attention that they would prefer not to have in the circumstances. So there was a fair degree of animosity towards the people that were behind the Russell Street bombing.
Detectives faced the huge challenge of recovering the thousands of pieces of evidence that were spread over 3 city blocks. Any single fragment could have represented the vital clue that would lead police to whoever planted the bomb.
And we were able to piece together, bit by bit, what was in the vehicle at the time it was detonated outside Russell Street.
Piecing together that car, bit by bit, is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. How they found bits of that car a kilometre away and were able to put it in the right spot. Amazing, amazing investigation.
And our headquarters was over 50 metres or more away from the blast, and yet the roof of the ambulance headquarters had shrapnel spread across it. And I think this piece indicates just the size of the shrapnel that was launched and that distance. The actual gauge of the steel is extremely thick compared to what a modern car would be, and to think what this could have done should there been more people in Russell Street at the time, I think our injury level could have been much, much higher.
The bomb was an offcut of 4x2 timber, where by the alarm going off on the alarm clock completed the electronic circuit between a battery and the electric detonators, which of course caused the bomb to detonate. crude but effective device.
Despite the fact the scene was littered with forensic evidence, police were still unable to pinpoint any individuals who may have been responsible for planting the bomb. That was to change, however, when the Russell Street Task Force were made aware of a bank robbery that took place just hours after the bombing.
4 o'clock on the afternoon of the bombing, there was an armed robbery committed on the National Australia Bank at Donvale. The getaway vehicle was a silver Holden Brock Special. That silver Brock Special was located in the Yarra River at Wonga Park, a northern suburb of Melbourne, some days after the Russell Street bombing. This vehicle was put on the back of a flat-top trailer and taken to the Coot Road compound, and 2 detectives from the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad were there to meet it. Sitting in the corner of the Coot Road compound was the remnants of the Russell Street bomb car. So Arthur Adams and John Bradbury, 2 of the detectives from the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad, they started out of curiosity looking at the bomb wreck, and they were both surprised to see that the identifying numbers in the chassis had been drilled out, because that to them was an unusual way of removing identifying numbers from a vehicle. The most common way of doing it was to grind them. The Silver Brock Special arrived on the back of the flat top and it was unloaded, and they opened up the bonnet, and the first thing they noticed was it had also had its chassis numbers drilled out. They were rather astonished. They found 2 vehicles in the one place on the one day that had been dealt with in an identical fashion. So Arthur Adams, the sergeant, came back to the task force office, and he made a statement there, and then he said, "I believe the person who stole the bomb car also stole that Silver Rock Special."
Detectives now turned their attention to the theft of the car involved in the bank robbery. Police discovered that the getaway car's number plates had actually been recovered following a car chase some weeks before, involving known criminal Peter Reid. Could he be the link between the bomb car and the getaway vehicle? On the 25th of April 1986, almost a month after the bombing, police raided 3 addresses connected to Reid and his brother, Stephen Komiarzik.
It was Anzac Day, it was the 25th of April. A series of raids were conducted simultaneously at Reid's address in Callista, at 15 Harros Avenue, Nuttawading, and at Stephen Komiarzik's address in Olive Grove, Boronia.
As the detectives approached the properties, they were tragically unaware of what lay ahead.
The robbery squad members who went to Peter Reid's address were met with gunfire.
He's standing up on the bed, shooting it out. Mark Wiley got shot in the stomach, who was lucky to survive.
Mark was one of the first people through the door at the Callista address. And as Mark approached Peter Reid's bedroom, Reid stood up and fired at him with a revolver. And a number of shots come through the wall and the door. And 2 of them, from memory, struck Mark, and he went down in a critical condition. Steve Quincy was a detective sergeant at the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad at the time. He courageously went into the line of fire, and he returned fire and wounded Peter Reid. Of course, at that stage, we had a very seriously injured police officer and a very seriously injured offender.
Mark Wiley and Peter Reid were both rushed to hospital for life-saving surgery. Meanwhile, back at the property, a thorough search was underway.
In a canvas army-style bag, we found gel-ignite and detonators. There were some firearms found at the address which, interestingly, had the identifying numbers drilled out of them in an identical way to the motor vehicle. We also found a copy of a newspaper wrapped around some gel-ignite, and a petty criminal named Rodney Minogue, his fingerprint was on one of the pages. We also found a partial fingerprint on the toilet door that belonged to another petty criminal named Craig William John Minogue. We were then very interested in speaking to the Minogue brothers, and despite our best efforts, we were just unable to locate them.
Unfortunately for the police, Craig Minogue and his brother Rodney had disappeared. As the search for them got underway, attention turned to an individual who was staying at the Harros Avenue address, named Carl Zelinka. He had no previous criminal history, but detectives were sure he knew more than he was telling them.
We actually spoke to Carl and spoke to him about his knowledge of the Minogues, and he denied knowing them and denied knowing Peter Reid. And we knew that wasn't right because we'd spoken to his neighbours, and we'd shown neighbours photographs of the Minogues and Peter Reid, and neighbours had identified them as being people that frequented 15 Harros Avenue, Nunawading. So Carl was lying through his teeth to us, but we couldn't quite work out what the motivation for it all was at that stage.
From the examination of the crime scene, the forensic were able to put together how the bomb had been set up. And it had been put on a block of wood with an alarm clock. As a result of going to Harros Avenue, Nunawading, we found that the block of wood matched a fence post at Harros Avenue.
Some slivers of timber which fitted perfectly across a fault line in the bomb block and also still attached to the fencing. So we knew in our own mind then scientifically that the bomb block of wood had come from the fence line at 15 Harros Avenue, Nunawading, and we then formed a fairly strong view that Carl Zelinka knew a lot more about the Minogues and Peter Reid than he was telling us.
Faced with increasingly incriminating evidence against him, Zelinka began to talk, and one of the crucial pieces of information he provided was the name of another man who he thought could be involved.
They used to refer to him as Stan the Man, and I had a very diligent detective on my crew named Mark Harris, and I said to Mark, go to the record section and find Stan the Man. And he found a male person in his early 50s, Stanley Brian Taylor, whose driver's licence was registered to the Minogues' parents' address. That then formed the identification of Stan the Man.
Yeah, he'd been involved on the wrong side of the law for most of his life, from the age of 12, I think. And he'd done a lot of hold-ups and other crimes.
He was a serious armed robber, really not the type of fellow you'd expect to be hanging out with a couple of young fellows like the Minogues. But what had happened was that when Stan was released from prison, he'd become a social worker, and he was employed out in the Muralbark area to work with youth, supposedly to keep them out of trouble and to not make the mistakes in life that he'd made.
He was fairly charismatic. He'd been to jail, he'd robbed banks, he'd come out, he used to get acting bit parts in Australian drama series. So he had some sort of allure for these young men, and he groomed them in the guise of helping them on the straight and narrow. He was in fact grooming them to be young attack dogs, and he turned them into very effective armed robbers.
This afternoon, a man was flown to Swan Hill by the police air wing. The Birchip man has also agreed to a further interview period by police over the Russell Street bombing.
He knew his way around the system very well, but he also knew that first in was best dressed when it came to doing deals.
Taylor immediately nominated the Minogues and Peter Reid as the Russell Street bombers. Not so quick to implicate himself.
Stanley Brian Taylor eventually gave us a phone number for the boys, which turned into be the Lady Jane Motel at Swan Hill. They raided the motel room and the two boys were in bed, and the loaded sawn-off shotgun was laying on the floor between them. As they were arrested and being led out of the room, Craig Minogue said to Rodney, "Remember the rules, Rodney." And that's all he said. From that stage on, he wouldn't be interviewed, he wouldn't talk at all. But they were all subsequently charged with the bombing.
with the chief suspects in custody, detectives focused their attentions on the next challenge: to assemble a case that would convince a jury that they had caught the right men. In 1988, the trial began of the men charged with committing one of the most heinous acts of terrorism in Australian history. A huge car bomb had claimed the life of 21-year-old police officer Angela Taylor and sent shockwaves through the city. As the court date approached, the meticulous and diligent police investigation into who had planted the bomb was about to be revealed.
The volume of physical evidence was staggering, really, and how we could tie each person into it. But all that had to come into the court, so it was good evidence.
Another major source of evidence came from an associate of Craig Minogue, Taylor and Reid, called Paul Hetzel. He had a history of violent crime and robbery, and when arrested in June 1986, he agreed to tell what he knew about the plot. He described the alleged bombers as having a hatred of police and a desire to kill as many officers as possible.
Now, Hetzel was an interesting character. He knew straight away who was involved in the Russell Street bombing, and he'd been privy to conversations in the lead up to it, and we located him a couple of days after the arrest of Stan Taylor, and Gary Ayres and I interviewed Paul Hetzel over the course of a day or two, and he told us the whole history, filled in a few missing spots that we're unaware of course, and that Karl Zelenka wasn't aware of. So Hetzel virtually filled in all the missing pieces that we hadn't at that stage.
The trial of the alleged bombers began in January 1988. Peter Reid, Craig and Rodney Minogue, and Stan Taylor faced a number of charges, including murder and conspiring to blow up the Russell Street Police headquarters. In proceedings before the trial started, the charges against Stephen Komiarczyk were dropped due to insufficient evidence.
The offenders were faced a committal proceeding at the Melbourne Magistrates Court, and in fact I was the first witness. And I gave my evidence of my observations, and as I walked out of the court, Craig Minogue spat on me, and I just looked at him and walked out.
Well, it was one of the longest criminal trials in Victoria's history. Trial raged for months. Witnesses were in the witness box for days on end. The integrity of people was attacked by defence counsel, as is normal in a high-profile criminal trial. I will say this, Hetzel and Zelenka gave evidence that, in my mind, was 100% truthful. We'd corroborated virtually everything that those two men told us. Unfortunately, it's difficult when you have a criminal giving evidence in a criminal trial against his colleagues. There's no doubt in my mind that the jury were quite happy with Karl Zelenka because he did not have a criminal history. I'm not sure they were as convinced as to Paul Hetzel's integrity.
In August 1988, and after a trial that lasted almost 8 months, featuring 156 witnesses, at last the jury returned its verdict.
Stan Taylor was convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, never to be released. Craig Minogue was convicted. He was sentenced to 40 years with a 27-year minimum. Young Rodney Minogue was convicted and sentenced to accessory after the fact of the Russell Street bombing. Peter Reid was acquitted. However, he was convicted by the jury of using a firearm to prevent apprehension and attempted murder of Detective Sergeant Steve Quincy, who was the police officer who actually shot him. Peter Reid's acquittal was a bitter pill. The jury were locked up for months in a very difficult criminal trial. You can never be critical of juries. They do their very best in very difficult circumstances. And I think really when you look at the evidence they listened to, they gave a verdict that was in their mind was the correct and just one to give. So, you know, that's life.
Handing down one of the toughest sentences since the abolition of the death penalty in Australia, the judge likened the actions of Craig Minogue and Stan Taylor to an act of war. Rodney Minogue's conviction was later overturned on appeal. His brother Craig is eligible for parole from 2016.
Craig Minogue, he's made something of himself whilst he's in custody. He's a PhD or a doctorate of some sort. So, you know, it's going to be up to someone like the parole board to be able to make that decision and say, well, is he a fit person to be put back into the community? Has he been rehabilitated?
Look, Craig Minogue is a very dangerous individual who demonstrated he was capable of extreme violence. I'll always be very concerned that the real Craig Minogue might one day do something else if he is released. Stan Taylor, of course, will never be released. Stan's a dreadful human being. His life has just been one catastrophic waste. He's damaged a lot of people along the way. My understanding is he really has a visitor in prison, and he's going to die in prison, a lonely old man, and which is really what he deserves.
7507, we have people with injuries. We require ambulance, please.
It was a statement of war, and all I can say is those who were involved in it, all I can say, they are the biggest fucking cowards you can ever imagine. How dare they, with a car full of explosives, park out in front of a police station, have no regard to anyone coming in and out of courts, walking up and down streets, and are prepared to blow everyone up. I'd look them in the eye and tell them, you're just fucking cowards.
I don't believe any of these people should ever be released back into society. If someone's got a propensity to do what they did, that propensity will still be there. And if they do get out, it's my firm belief that they won't last very long.
With the perpetrators locked up for their offences, the city of Melbourne tried to move on. That is until 1992, when the disappearance of a young teenage girl, 6 years after the explosion, would bring the Russell Street bomb back to the headlines. With the Russell Street bombers behind bars after a trial that lasted 8 months, Melbourne began to move on. Until the abduction of a girl made headlines, and rumours began to circulate that it was connected to the bombing.
Prue Bird was the teenage daughter of a woman called Jenny Bird, and Prue Bird disappeared in 1992. One sunny Sunday afternoon, she vanished from the face of the earth. Her mother suspects from very early days that it's a very sinister disappearance connected with her mother's connection with this major criminal.
Prue's grandmother, Julie, had started a relationship with a man closely associated with the Russell Street bombing. His name was Paul Hetzel, the star witness in the trial of the bombers back in 1988.
She met Paul when she used to visit jail. When he gets out of jail, he manipulates her to purchase weapons, to have driver's licences and to rent properties, houses and things. All he brings to the relationship is a briefcase with a pistol in it. He's a very bad man. He knows other very bad men. Among them are a group of people led by a man called Stan Taylor, and including two brothers, Rodney and Craig Minogue, and another man called Peter Reid.
As these 4 men were standing trial, charged with numerous offences relating to the Russell Street bombing, disturbing rumours began to surface.
During the court case, Prue's grandmother gives evidence that one of the bombers, Craig Minogue, had once threatened her, and he had said to her, if you ever talk about us or dob us into the police or inform what will happen to one of your grandkids, like dear little Prue.
Allegedly, Minogue made that threat to the Hetzels when Prue Bird was there at 7 years of age, asleep in the other room. Now, Craig Minogue denies that, but I believe the Hetzels.
Craig Minogue has consistently denied making any such threat to Julie and Paul Hetzel about their granddaughter Prue and any involvement in her disappearance. Her body has never been found. In 2009, new information came to light that seemingly pointed police in a new direction.
17 years later, in jail in Victoria, a very bad man called Leslie Camilleri starts talking about being connected with not only the murders he's been convicted of, which were horrific murders, he starts to tell people that he was involved in the Prue Bird case. The police get to hear about this. They go and see him and they said, look, we just want to clear this up, can you help? Leslie Camilleri is a monster, but he's a monster who doesn't want to get himself killed in jail. And he realises if he gives a very clear story, that there's a fair chance that he will be killed in jail. So what he does is he goes to court and he gives a sort of a lame half version of the truth. And he said that he had abducted Prue, but he wouldn't supply all the links and he wouldn't identify where the body was.
Leslie Camilleri was found guilty and in 2013 sentenced to 28 years for admitting the murder of Prue Bird. He refused to give any details about the circumstances of her death and the location of her body. Despite his claims he acted alone, some remain convinced there was another person involved. For others, the links between Prue's disappearance and the Russell Street bomb refused to fade away.
I believe the threat was made, and I don't think Camilleri's telling everything that he knows. He certainly admitted killing the girl, but there's a lot more behind it. There's more to it, and I think even any investigator will say the same, but unless you get the information, you can't take it any further.
I'm certain in my own mind that Prue Bird was murdered as a consequence of Julie and Paul Hetzel's evidence they gave at the trial.
The Russell Street bomb was one of the first major terrorist attacks the state of Victoria had witnessed. It is nothing short of miraculous that the explosion claimed only a single life. Both Ian West and Constable Carl Donadio, who were severely wounded by shrapnel from the bomb, recovered from their injuries. The mental scars for them and the city as a whole, however, were not so quick to heal.
It seemed to me that criminals in Victoria had reached that moral level where they just didn't care what they did. And I think Russell Street was the start of that.
The Russell Street bombing was a turning point in the history of Melbourne. It is still talked about, and it's amazing how many people, when it comes up or the anniversaries come up, everyone remembers where they were and what they were doing at that particular time.
Probably won't leave me. But we'll do the best we can. But I just feel so sorry for the Taylor family. As I said, they haven't had the benefit of seeing her marry, having grandkids. Yeah, no, it's awful.
Angela's left a lot behind to remind everybody of the work that she did and the love that she had for a job. One of the lovely tangible things is Angela's Rose, and that's beautiful. And that's around some police stations and, it's everywhere, isn't it, Arthur? And so we have the Blue Ribbon Foundation with all the fun runs and activities where money is raised. It goes to giving equipment to hospitals so that the life continues on. Even though we haven't got Angela in her way, she's still working to save other lives.
Almost 30 years after the explosion, the Russell Street bomb claimed another victim. Mark Wiley, the detective shot during the raid on Peter Reid's address, tragically took his own life in 2014.
Mark Wiley was a colleague of mine in the Victoria Police and a thorough gentleman and one of the best investigators I ever worked with. And he's a perfect example of the effects of trauma can have on you years later. Now, we all knew Mark was in a bit of trouble mentally for the last 12 months of his life. A lot of people tried to assist him, but unfortunately it didn't work.
I don't think Mark ever recovered. He had demons after being shot and the dreadful consequences of that.
One of the tragedies of it all, that people don't know what's going on in other people's heads or their minds or their hearts, and often they don't seek the help they clearly need. Although tragically it's only clear that they need it after the event, after it's too late.
Constantly dealing with traumatic incidents and constantly being in a situation where there's a degree of physical risk, there's no doubt in my mind that that we all pay a price for that. I think we really need to do a lot more work around looking after some of those people than we probably do at the moment. And I think Victoria Police as an organisation, we're really starting to closely look at this now and starting to put things in place where we deal with this. See, of course, the difficulty is when these people leave our organisation, they get lost. And you know, I think Mark was an example of that.
Just 90 minutes drive southeast of Melbourne, Phillip Island, with its rugged beauty, is the perfect destination for a short break. But in August 2009, that tranquility was shattered when human remains began to wash up onto the shore.
Police are hoping missing person reports could shed some light on a gruesome find at Phillip Island.
The grisly discovery would stun a family.
There was a black and white photo of a tattoo and something about a leg being found, and I looked at it and I thought, what's that?
They say they're confident they're closing in on Rachel's killer, and quickly.
He asked her whether she'd like to come in and see a dissection.
The dark past of a killer would shine a light on the nation's justice system.
This guy is a master manipulator. He had people wrapped around his little fingers, and the system allowed him out to do this.
There is no such thing as closure for me, and there never will be. There never has been any sense of closure at all.
Revelations in court would uncover one of Australia's most evil killers.
God knows what he really did, or even definitely where he did it, because no DNA was recovered from the bathroom where she was supposed to have been cut up.
The murder of Rachel Betts was a crime that shook Australia. In August 2009, 27-year-old childcare worker Rachel Betts went missing from her home in Epping, a northern suburb of Melbourne. What happened to her would leave a family devastated and shine a light on the nation's criminal justice system.
At the start of Rachel's life, Rachel was an only child for about 11 years. I had her at a time when most of my friends didn't have children. So she was very popular with my friends. She was a real asset to the family all the time. She was great with her cousins, my nieces. She was the eldest of the 7 girls.
Rachel was a very loving girl. It's not unusual in a step-parenting situation where the children are not too happy about one of their parents having a new partner and vice versa, and possibly having step-siblings. And Rachel built bridges between my children and the younger 2 girls.
Rachel was really good at making friends with strangers pretty much on the spot. Anybody she wanted to meet, she would just march right up and do so. Like, very bubbly and very good at making people feel welcome and like they were instantly the most important person around her. Just fun and lovable.
Although we lived together, sometimes we didn't see each other every day. I'd hear her get up in the morning. I always knew she was up and awake and getting ready because I could smell her toast and coffee.
She was always happy and bouncy. She was always happy to see you, happy to help. She was just one of those people who inspired you to be better. She was Rachel. You have a problem, you call her, she's there.
I could always call and talk to her if I was, say, like having an argument at home or worried about school or my personal issues with friends or anything like that. She always made us feel that she would never judge us.
As she got older, she began to be interested in other things like education. She really wanted to be like a teacher and a carer of children, which might have been influenced by babysitting us all the time.
Rachel had devoted her life to children. By the age of 27, she had a successful career as a childcare worker. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to have children of her own. In late 2008, she met 2 teenagers who were looking for a place to stay. Rachel's caring nature meant she was quick to welcome them into her home.
Rachel had met them through a friend of ours' neighbour, so they started to drop in and they were both having issues at home. So Rachel, being Rachel, went, any problems, you can always come here and stay here.
When Rachel took the girls in October 2008, November 2008, the second one, they really took over her life. And at first I thought that they were the source of the problems. The longer the girls were with her, the more she seemed run down, and I was sort of thinking, well, she's overworked and this is getting too much for her.
She was always stressed about money and being able to get by, basically being able to provide. Had 2 jobs and she lost one of them.
Faced with an ever-dwindling income, looking after the 2 girls was beginning to take its toll on Rachel and left her in an increasingly vulnerable situation. When an opportunity to make some extra money arose, Rachel was keen to take advantage.
Rachel had met a fellow, and this fellow had been working with an older man, and that older man had said to this guy that he was looking for young people to recruit to sell drugs, and for some reason this guy introduced Rachel to him, and as I understand it, came round and did a sell, you know. Oh, look at you, you're trying to look after 2 kids and you're working so hard with 2 jobs, and, you know, you could have the girls through the day and run them around, and at night time you could go out to some nightclubs and pubs or whatever, and you can meet up with people, you can sell some drugs, you'll make a lot of money, your life will be easier, things will be better for you if you do this. How he managed to make that sell, I don't know, but she decided to give it a go. I guess she probably thought I could stop work for a while, see how it goes, you know. The problem with when you're moving with people who take those drugs, rather than just selling it, she was actually taking it. And it began to have quite a severe effect on her after a while.
Rachel began abusing crystal meth, or ice, an insidious drug that is ravaging parts of Australia. It began to take a terrible toll on Rachel, both physically and mentally, and her life began to spiral out of control.
We actually ended up having, after living together for years, ended up having a bit of an argument, and I moved out in March of 2009. I can honestly say she probably knew me better than anybody, and same for me with her, but by that time I couldn't tell you what she'd been up to for the day. Usually I could tell you what she ate for breakfast, lunch and dinner.
She started to develop some of these symptoms of paranoia, and it was obvious that something was wrong. She said there were all these people she didn't know were coming around. Friends of the young girls were coming around, and she was feeling uncomfortable and unsafe. This paranoia thing that comes with taking these drugs was affecting her. She started becoming delusional. She had all kinds of strange experiences where she thought she was being watched or being followed. She was involved in a car accident where this car came through a red light and she thought that it had been set up and somehow deliberate. These sort of delusional ideas that do come with that particular drug, ice. Her teeth were very important to her. Smile was beautiful. And here she is taking this drug that is making her grind her teeth. And that really distressed me. I cried when I saw she had a baby's dummy by the bed to put between her teeth so that she wouldn't grind them and that she'd protect those front teeth. But my God, what is going on here? And I could see that there was this deterioration in her.
The final straw for her friends and family came when Rachel collapsed at her friend's home.
She went to the hospital to be examined because they thought they may have been drugged and raped. So took her to the doctors to make sure everything was checked out. They were safe, blood tests. The crisis assessment team came because she wasn't well. Unfortunately, I think it was the drugs that got to her and made her paranoid.
They assessed her, took her to the hospital, got her into rehab to dry her out, and July she was back here with us, with her sisters and myself, and in a safe place.
Despite returning home, the temptations of her other life were proving too much for Rachel.
She had a party one night, a couple of friends round, and the girls were here and they had come out to stay for a couple of nights and they were getting noisy. The point is to keep her away from any drugs, and there wasn't supposed to be any drugs, so I asked them to leave. Anyway, Rachel took it as an opportunity to go and take the girls and go off to this other place that she had been organising for them to live at.
When she was leaving, she was distressed, and I was quite distressed too. She just felt, I think, stifled, living under her mother's roof again. I remember saying to her that you're being looked after here, that it had been a positive thing that she was here. But I think she felt guilty, and the last words she ever said to me in person were, "If I leave tonight, will you still love me tomorrow?" And I started to cry and said, "Of course I will." I felt like I had only just gotten my big sister back for the first time in quite a while. And to have her leave that night, I was filled with dread. I knew that nothing good could come of it.
What her family couldn't have known was that it would be the last time they would see Rachel alive.
Human remains have washed up on a beach southeast of Melbourne. The gruesome discovery was made by a man jogging along Ventnor Beach on Phillip Island.
In August 2009, The friends and family of Rachel Betts were becoming increasingly worried for her welfare. The 27-year-old childcare worker had, in the last few months, been involved with both drug abuse and dealing, and her loved ones were growing concerned.
I rang her up especially to say to her to please come home here to this house. I said to her, I'm really worried. You're not safe there. You're safe here. Please come home, I said. They were my last words to her. Please come home.
On the 18th of August, a new story broke about a grisly discovery at a popular tourist destination.
Police are hoping missing person reports could shed some light on a gruesome find at Phillip Island, a woman's tattooed left leg. The tattoo features red and violet flowers on a twisting vine.
The revelation about the tattooed leg set off alarm bells for Sandra. Holding on to the slender hope that her daughter was alive and well, she began frantically calling Rachel's friends.
I phoned Epping and asked the girls, where's Rachel? And have you heard from her? Have you spoken to her? And the youngest one lied to me and said, oh, yes, I heard from her about lunchtime and this isn't right. And so I said, put the other girl on the phone. And she said, oh, no, I haven't seen her for days and we've been calling and she's not answering. And this was just totally out of character. If Rachel was doing something, those girls would know exactly where she was going, exactly when she'd be back, how to contact her while she was away.
Rachel had disappeared and we didn't know where she was, and Sandra was getting very frantic. She'd started placing calls to friends and family and sent text out to everybody that she thought Rachel knew.
Her mother called me up one day and messaged me, so 12 at night time, midnight, and I've gone, who's messaging me at midnight, And I found out it was a clear call with Sandra, Rachel's mum. Have you seen Rachel? So I called up and said, this is David. No, I haven't seen her for 2 months. She's supposed to be in rehab. And that's when she told me about the foot they found on the beach, where the tattoo was same as Rachel's. So they started the course to worry that Rachel may have died or something may have happened to her.
At the location of the grim discovery on Phillip Island, detectives were beginning to arrive at the beach that was now a crime scene.
I was afternoon on call on Sunday, the 16th of August 2009. I was contacted by Detective Sergeant Sean Audley, and he advised that a leg had been found at New Haven Beach, Phillip Island. It was a female leg, a full female leg. It had been severed around the hip joint, but it appeared that I guess it would be a non-survivable incident that had occurred, so expected foul play pretty much straight away. There was a floral tattoo on the foot that gave us something at least to go and start checking our records to see if there were missing persons firstly, and there's various databases of people with tattoos. They were looked at in the following days and we weren't really getting anywhere with that. That came to nothing.
Rain got onto the computer and looked up some photos on Facebook, and she saw a photo of Rachel dancing barefoot, and it was definitely the left foot that had the tattoo on it. And that's when I phoned the police and said, look, I think that this is my daughter.
DNA testing conclusively proved Sandra's worst fears. The leg did indeed belong to her daughter. 3 weeks later, further remains were found on another beach, followed by reports of a right leg sighted by the crew of a ferry. Tragically, the rest of Rachel's body was never recovered. Now they had identified the victim, police began to investigate Rachel's background for clues as to what had led to her tragic death. It wasn't long until her associations with the world of illegal drugs came to light.
She was working in childcare till about end of 2008, and after that point in time, 2009, it appears that that's when the drug dealing took off.
Rachel had been given the impression that she could make easy money quickly. It meant for Rachel that she could get that bigger house, have that money for the rent and bond to move herself, the girls, they'd have their own room. It wasn't for a lavish lifestyle, it was so that Rachel felt that she could provide for them. It just didn't work out that way for her.
Rachel's mother, Sandra, was aware that her daughter was mixing with nefarious characters, and one name in particular was causing her great concern. 54-year-old parolee, John Leslie Coombs.
I had conversations with her about John Coombs and said, this man sounds really wrong to me. And she said, well, he's got a criminal history. I said, well, you've got to avoid this person. This is not good.
A search of Rachel's home in Epping was also making detectives suspicious about John Coombs.
There were various diaries that mentioned various people that she knew, lots of phone numbers. Also, some drug dealing type of equations were in these things as well. There's a reference to being scared of a JC, whom we believe to be John Coombs. But the more digging we did, I suppose speaking to friends of Rachel, we realised that John Coombs was her boss in relation to drug dealing. And we also spoke to one person who said that Rachel told them that she was going fishing with her boss, and she was looking forward to it. Going fishing seemed to be code for going away and dealing in drugs or drug type of trip. And those closest to her knew that's what the terminology meant. And we also go through the list of names of people that she knew, and obviously John Coombs stood out because of his prior criminal history. Rachel's family, they knew obviously how close Rachel was with these girls in her care, and they found it very hard to believe that these girls didn't know where Rachel had gone on that Tuesday evening. These girls were very fearful. They were told by Rachel that she was gone and she'd be on a fishing trip for 48 hours at the latest sort of thing. So after that period of time, they became increasingly concerned. They did know that she went away with John Coombs, but they were terrified to speak with us about it. They thought the best course of action was to keep it to themselves. I think they got a bit of an idea that we were on the right track with Mr Coombs anyway. I dealt with the two girls fairly regularly over that first 2 months. I ended up taking about half a dozen statements from the youngest one, who was probably closest to Rachel. And she took a while to warm to us as well, because all she'd really known, I suppose, was she'd seen Rachel drug trafficking, and I guess police were the enemy if you're out there drug trafficking. And after a while, she decided that it was okay to divulge what she did know, and she knew a lot.
With the help of the young girl, detectives were able to trace Rachel's last movements. On the 10th of August, 6 days before her remains were found, Rachel drove the 20 minutes from Epping to Heidelberg, where she left her car, and was allegedly picked up at some nearby shops by John Coombs. The last time anyone was in contact with Rachel was 6:30 that night, when she spoke to her friend Deanne on the phone. The call betrayed none of the imminent danger Rachel was in.
She'd said to me she was going fishing. She'd be back, and I said, well, because we'd planned to meet up on the Monday. And she said, no, I'll be fine, I'll be back. And I said, seemed happy and to be doing whatever maybe she was doing. It sounded to me like she was jumping in a car. She didn't seem scared. To my understanding, when Rachel was talking, she was happy about wherever she was going. So at no point did she sound threatened or anything like that. I don't believe Rachel thought that she wasn't coming back.
When questioned by police, Coombs provided a seemingly solid alibi to explain his movements at the time of Rachel's disappearance. His associates corroborated his story. However, using mobile phone tracking and other techniques, detectives were quick to cast doubt on his version of events. As their suspicions grew, and in order to establish the facts, the decision was made to arrest John Coombs. Also arrested were his associates, Coombs' 54-year-old partner, Maureen Renwick, another acquaintance, Nicole Godfrey, and friend, Ryan Buscema.
We believe we had sufficient evidence to arrest him and to charge him with the murder of Rachel Betts, but also the other people that we arrested at the time too, as in Maureen Renwick, Ryan Buscema and Nicole Godfrey. So it was a coordinated arrest of all of those people to get their version of events at the same time. So once we arrested him, we placed him in the vehicle, and Lee Smith said to him the hardest part, saying it. And he said, "Yeah, I know. She pushed my buttons," and he said, "I killed her. She made me fucking angry. She taunted me." That's what he said.
Police now had Rachel's alleged killer in custody. They now had to determine exactly what had happened to her. With the suspected murderer of Rachel Betts in custody, the dark, chilling past of John Leslie Coombs began to emerge. In the first of a series of interviews with the alleged killer, the detective's first task was to try and establish from Coombs exactly how Rachel had met her tragic and untimely death.
No one really knows exactly what happened to Rachel. We've got Mr. Coombs' version of events as to when I interviewed him. He said that they drove down there together to Phillip Island, to 3 Terry Crescent, Wimbledon Heights, Nicole Godfrey's house, and that they arrived there after midnight, and that Nicole Godfrey had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea with the two of them. Mr. Coombs says that after they had their coffee or whatever, Rachel went and lay in one of the rooms on the bed.
Detectives were stunned when, in an effort to explain what had happened to her, Coombs claimed that Rachel was implicated in the abuse of the 2 girls she was caring for.
Mr. Coombs claimed that Rachel let him know that she'd allowed for the girls to be sexually assaulted, and that she made money out of it because the girls got to pay her debts. And Coombs claimed that infuriated him, and he decided to put her on a sleeper hold and strangle her. I said, well, how did you do it? And he showed with arm movements as to what he did in relation to strangling Rachel.
Coombs went on to describe how he mutilated Rachel's body.
He said that she deserved to die, didn't deserve to go to leave this earth as a woman. So he says he's, stabbed her repeatedly in the breast region, and I believe that was after she'd died. You had to look at it as if this was a side of beef. That's how he kind of described it. It was something where the life had gone. It's a piece of meat that he had to just make the cuts, separate the joints, treat it like that. That's how he referred to it. He did that when I interviewed him. He explained it that way, and he also explained it the same way to Maureen Renwick in a prison phone call. He said they had to make something bigger, smaller. Pretty horrendous.
Another chilling version of events came from Nicole Godfrey, Coombs' acquaintance, who was present in the house on the supposed night of Rachel's murder.
She talked about limbs popping and things like that she could hear, and that at one stage he asked her whether she'd like to come in and see a dissection. So she was certainly present whilst this was going on in her bathroom, and it was quite a small 3-bedroom house down there.
Despite the detail and the description, detectives questioned the veracity of Coombs' version of events.
At one point, he did talk to Maureen on the phone about it, and he said something about the manner of death, and it was like one click. It was the cleanest kill ever. So you hear that and you say to yourself, well, what is that then? Is that a strangulation? Is that breaking of the neck? Or what is that? It could be I don't know.
In my mind, I saw him cutting out her tattoos on her abdomen. He also cut her breasts off. And again, we got all kinds of stories. Oh, he used 5 different knives. Oh no, he used a box cutter that you keep cutting the thing.
It's hard to believe a word that comes out of Mr. Coombs' mouth. It's very difficult to know when it was that she was actually killed. There was no forensic evidence, but they did clean with bleach-based cleaning products.
God knows what he really did, or even definitely where he did it, because no DNA was recovered from the bathroom where she was supposed to have been cut up.
It came as no surprise to Sandra Betts when John Leslie Coombs was charged with her daughter's murder in November 2009.
When the police asked us who did we think it would likely to be, we said John Coombs, because we knew he had some kind of criminal history, and at the time that was all I knew. I now know a great deal more about him.
There was a lot of police reports, a lot of coronial reports that we had to go through to look at Coombs's past, and it's a very dark past. We were told that Coombs had two previous convictions, and two major previous convictions where he'd killed two people.
He killed a fellow by the name of Michael Sperani in February 1984.
Michael Sperani lived in the seaside town of Mount Martha. In 1984, he was selling his car, and his potential purchaser was one John Leslie Coombs. On the pretense of confirming whether the car could tow a boat, Coombs hitched up a trailer and then offered Michael the chance to accompany him on a trip out to sea.
John Coombs enticed Michael Sperani to come out for a ride on the boat.
It transpired that Sperani was dating one of Coombs's friends, a relationship that his friend disapproved of. Coombs seemingly had thought of a solution to this problem.
It appears he was assaulted on the boat and he was stabbed by Coombs. He was thrown out into the water, and Coombs then ran over him with the boat's propeller, and then after a while went up to him and pulled him up slightly and then stabbed him some more. And Coombs made a comment to his wife at the time when he later relayed what happened, and said that he stabbed him a little bit so the fish could finish him off.
"44-year-old Henry Desmond Kells was asleep in his Edith Vale home when he was attacked in the early hours of the 17th of November, 1984.
Another good friend of his by the name of Opie, it appears that Kells was socialising with Opie's landlady, and this upset Opie, and Opie complained to Coombs about it, and Coombs thought he'd go and fix that problem as well.
Broke into the bungalow knowing he would be asleep and drunk, and attacked him in a really vicious way. He pinned him down. There were bruises on Kells' feet and knees.
There's evidence that he's punching and that sort of thing, and then Coombs went to the kitchen, got a knife and stabbed him and killed him, and also mutilated his genitalia. We believe it's probably to try and give the impression that there'd been some sort of sexual transgression and maybe revenge had taken place, something like that, which seems to be another theme with Mr. Coombs as well. He seems to blame sexual misbehaviour, or he alleges sexual misbehaviour on behalf of victims, and he did that on that occasion with Sperani, and I believe he was probably trying to give the same impression in relation to what happened with Desmond Kells as well.
In 1985, Coombs was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Henry Desmond Kells. He was granted an 11-year minimum term on appeal. At his parole hearing, the board was told that Coombs did not pose a substantial threat to the community. What they weren't aware of, though, was that he had murdered Michael Sperani 8 months before killing Kells and had got away with it. Satisfied he was safe to release, Coombs left prison in October 1996. Within 3 months of being paroled, Coombs was arrested again and convicted of Sperani's murder. Despite being now responsible for the deaths of 2 men, but supposedly rehabilitated, he was handed a minimum term of just 10 years. By 2007, Coombs was released on parole back into the community, where he started a relationship with Maureen Renwick and began dealing drugs. Just 2 years after his release, while still on parole, Rachel would be dead.
And he did try and present as the jovial, grandfatherly type figure. He was quite cunning and devious the way he operated.
To look at him, you wouldn't think he was dangerous to that extent. I'd met him twice. My first reaction to him was, well, why are you hanging out with someone that's that age?
This guy is a master manipulator. He had people wrapped around his little fingers, and he cultivated a facade. There was this nice, jolly, plump guy who would never harm a fly.
While Rachel's loved ones tried to comprehend Coombs's dangerous past and began to ask questions of a justice system that let a killer out onto the streets not once, but twice, detectives were preparing to go to trial. In 2011, John Leslie Coombs was about to appear in court, charged with the murder of Rachel Betts. For his victim's family, the trauma and devastation of the past 2 years was about to be played out in public.
John Leslie Coombs will face the Melbourne Magistrates Court for allegedly strangling the 27-year-old and throwing her off a pier on Phillip Island.
First, you have the committal in the Magistrates Court, where they test to see whether the proceedings will be successful in the Supreme Court. It means that Coombs was able to introduce things in the Magistrates Court, claims about Rachel which were untrue.
The committal process, the media report all the things that are a bit sensational and made Rachel look to be a drug-using, drug-selling woman. The worst parts, I suppose, that came out from the witnesses, that was what was reported.
He claimed that Rachel had set these girls up for sex acts, for money and all this rubbish, and the girls were interviewed in the court and they said, no, that didn't happen, Rachel would never do that to us, etc. But he did succeed in besmirching her name, which was what he wanted to do. He got this rubbish into the press.
He said that Rachel said that if he played his cards right, she could have his way with the little one, as in the young girl, the younger of the two girls. When I interviewed about that and told him that he didn't say that previously to me, he goes, oh, I did. Well, he didn't. We went back and checked the transcripts from the interview and he never did.
To me, it was just another excuse to paint what he'd done in a better light, like as if he was doing society a favour by what he'd done.
I don't believe that she exposed those girls to or encouraged any sort of interference of them, allowed it to happen. There's no evidence at all to suggest that, apart from what comes out of Coombs's mouth, which cannot be believed at all.
Little could prepare Rachel's family for the emotional torment of being exposed to the baseless allegations about their sister, peddled by John Coombs.
We had to put up with a lot of lies being told about Rachel in the media, and we weren't really allowed to say anything back or do anything back, which was very hard for a long time.
I never realised how much the journalists themselves are able to pick and choose interesting or sort of headline-grabbing elements of any given case and put it together in their own way. Because the way that cases like these are portrayed to the public have a really quite a large influence on how the public then see the victim or see the perpetrator.
The way victims and their relatives are treated in court was a shock to the Betts family, and something they have been inspired to try and change.
That's an issue I'm raising at the moment, along with the issue of having your own barrister in court to represent the victim's interests specifically as a third party. And I think that that's something that happens in a lot of countries around the world, and it needs to be looked at here. We need the pendulum to shift a bit the other way. At the moment, the victim doesn't have equal rights to the accused, and the right to counsel, I think, is a very important one.
After the committal, we were booked off for trial, so I organised all the witnesses, and then on day one of the trial, he decided to plead guilty.
On the 26th of August 2011, John Leslie Coombs was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility for parole for the murder of Rachel Betts. The judge ordered that his sentence would be served cumulatively with his existing term for the Sperani murder. In passing sentence, the judge described Coombs as someone with a frightening predilection for murder.
I think the thing that stuck out the most was on the day of sentencing, when he was in court and they read out the sentence and he was being led from the dock out the side door, and he gave the finger up, known as the bird, to the courtroom on the way out, as if to say, well, I don't really care.
He stuck his finger up at him. Like, screw you, I killed your daughter and I'm still alive. Like, he's a monster who doesn't deserve to be alive.
It's really hard to say what justice is, isn't it? We got the best outcome that could be created in the circumstances. We got a judge who saw through all the lies and the stories and the accusations that Coombs made, and who saw that this is a person who had to get a life sentence with no minimum, and he really saw it clearly for what it was, because he didn't make them concurrent. He made consecutive life sentences. It will be life followed by life, and no minimum set.
As a way of coping with the loss of her daughter, Sandra Betts has fought for a more rigorous examination of the parole system, something that is a cornerstone of the Australian legal process.
Parole is a system that enables the gradual supervised release of people from prison into the community. So typically when someone is sentenced to a term of imprisonment, they will get a minimum sentence and a maximum sentence. And what determines when they're released after serving that minimum sentence is a decision by the parole authority, the parole board, and they have to decide, is it appropriate for that person to be released?
Well, the parole system was so broken. Coombs was recommended for parole on the basis that he was assessed as a low risk, a double murderer. I wouldn't have thought that that could be possible given the sentence he had. But because he was assessed as low risk and the parole board didn't question this, he was assigned to a junior corrections person. He wasn't monitored very much. So there weren't the checks, the cross-checking on what he's saying is true or not true, and what he's doing is what he says he's doing, what accommodation is the appropriate accommodation.
What we have seen in Victoria most recently is some very serious failures that have shone a light on the parole system, and that's been a good thing. It shouldn't have taken those horrific crimes for this kind of reform to happen. There's been a substantial increase in the parole board's budget. There's been improvements in the quality of information that is being presented to the parole board to enable it to make proper decisions around managing the risk to the community. We saw something like 10,000 decisions being made every year with only a few minutes for the parole board to consider each one of those decisions. When you consider the potential risks involved and the importance around those decisions, it really was an unsustainable practice that we had. That's now changing, and that's a positive thing.
The death of Rachel Betts and other high-profile murders has made the Australian justice system question itself and its processes. But despite the improvements that have and continue to be made, it is little comfort for Rachel's friends and family, who still have to live their lives without her.
The grief that comes with the sort of experience where your daughter is murdered is really intense and invasive, and it pervades daily life. Most mornings I will wake up with some thoughts of Rachel, and it's 6 years down the track, and there's always the important times, that her birthday, she'd be 33 now. It's awful. And I know it's not just me that's affected, my children have been very affected.
I miss my confidant. I miss the support, the unconditional support. I was looking forward to her teaching me how to drive and being there when I graduated high school. I have a sense of what she's lost as well, though, is what I've lost. I've lost my sister, my hero, but she's lost the potential of a full life.
It makes me really both angry and sad that she didn't get to see me become an adult myself, and then to be able to have that relationship with her on a different level, and like every, you know, new step I take in life, she doesn't get to know about that or to see that. And you see me become someone that we probably could have been even closer now than we were before. And I'm also kind of irrationally scared of overtaking her age. To become older than my older sister is really strange but scary to me.
I dread time moving forward. I remember dates and numbers, anniversaries, and I feel more hopeless and frustrated that every year goes by is another year further away from what happened.